Well, it's been 40 years. 40 years since what, you may ask? Well, 40 years since the release of the Commodore 64, the best-selling personal computer ever. In today's video, I'd like to talk about the Commodore 64 and, what it's capable of, what you can do with it, and what it's like to use. So let's see what $595 or around $1,800 in today's money would have gotten you back in 1982. And well, here it is, the Commodore 64, or the Commodore 64C to be specific. The version I have here is the later Commodore 64C, or cost-produced revision. The earlier model Commodore 64s look like this. They're often referred to as the bread bin C64s because they look like a bread box. But in 1986, they changed the design to this sleeker looking white model, and they consolidated some of the internals, but it's functionally identical to the original 1982 model. Personally, I prefer the 64C because it's actually a bit more reliable due to it using lower power chips in the original, and I think it just looks cooler. So let's look at what this thing has for ports and I/O. Starting from this side, we've got an expansion port. This gives full access to the system bus, a number of peripherals like add-on ROM cartridges as well as RAM expanders. We've got a RF port, and then this is for connecting it up to your TV, and then we've got a little switch for selecting what channel you want it to broadcast on. It was common to use your TV as a monitor back in the day. Next to that, we have a special video port, hooking it up to a dedicated monitor. We've got a serial port. We've got a port for connecting a tape drive. And we've got a parallel port, often referred to as the user port. Around the side, we've got two joystick ports. These are used for joysticks, as well as things like light pens and graphics tablets and mice and stuff too. And we've got a power switch. Now we've got a power port. As for the specs on this thing, it's built around the MOS Technologies 6510 CPU, which is a variation of the 6502. The only difference is the 6510 has a couple extra pins which are used to control RAM banking, but other than that, it's identical to the 6502. As for RAM, it has 64 kilobytes of RAM. That's where it gets its name from. The Commodore 64 with 64K of RAM, which was actually quite a bit back in the day, and that works out to about 0.000064 gigabytes. And it's got a video resolution of 320 by 200 with 16 colors on screen at once. It also has hardware sprites, which I'll talk more about later. So let's hook this thing up to a display and see what it can do. You have a couple different options for displays. First, and unfortunately probably the most common type of display for this thing, was just to use a regular old TV. That can be accomplished by using a cable like this and plug it into the RCA jack, which is actually an RF out. So it essentially will broadcast either channel 3 or 4, depending on what you have the little switch set to that's next to the RCA jack. You can use like a cable like this, and you can use like an antenna switch box like this, or just use this little thing which is an RCA jack on one end and then just screws on to the antenna jack on a TV. Picture quality from this can range from sort of okay and it's usable to pretty much unbearably bad. Sometimes you can get a better picture on channel 3, sometimes you can get a better picture on channel 4. You just have to play around to get a better signal. It really depends on how many other things you have around it interfering with it. This is not a very good way to use it, but a lot of people did use their TVs as monitors just because they had TVs and didn't want to spend even more money on a dedicated computer monitor. Okay, so the better and more expensive option back in the day would have been to get a dedicated monitor like the Commodore 1702. The Commodore 1702 is not the only dedicated monitor you can get for your 64, but it was the one that Commodore basically designed for use with the 64. So it is basically the monitor to have with your 64, and it's my display device of choice when I'm using my 64. To use the Commodore 1702, you'll need the special cable, which has like this RCA connection on one end, then the round DIN connection on the other end, and this plugs into that round DIN video port next to the RF modulator. Video quality from this is a lot better. It's hard to communicate on camera, how a CRT screen looks. And those rolling lines you might sometimes see, you can't actually see those in person. That's just because of the way the camera works, not quite syncing up with the refresh rate of the CRT. Same thing for that funky moire effect. Can't see that in person, that's just the way the camera interprets the shadow mask. Here are a couple of still images I took of the two different screens. And on camera, they don't really look all that much different, but in person you can definitely see quite a bit of difference. The Commodore 1702 is quite a bit sharper, a bit less washed out. There's basically no noise in the signal. The first thing you'll probably notice when you fire up the C64 is everything is very, very, very blue. Got a blue background, blue border, and blue text. So I hope you like blue. There obviously isn't much contrast with the blue on blue, and most people use C64s probably just end up changing the color to white or something by hitting Control 2. It's something I always do. So the Commodore 64, like many other computers from that time, boots up into something called BASIC, or Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code. It's an interpreted programming language. What we're in right now is sort of like the Python console. We can execute like single lines of codes, or we can enter into a program, make just like a more complex program with multiple lines by entering line numbers. So we can go like 10 print hello world, 20 go to 10, and we go up by 10s because then we can insert lines by going like 15. And you have to always specify the line number when entering a line of code in BASIC. That's just how these old editors work. BASIC is super convenient because you can start programming them right away without any additional software, and it was just super simple to write your own little programs to fulfill a specific need. You can also do other things like you type like print and then a math problem and it'll solve it for you. Print can actually be abbreviated with a question mark, and you could do things like set variables and print them out. Another really cool command that you don't really see on modern computers is poke. This allows you to modify the value of a specific area in memory. Poke 53280, we're going to set that, and the value stored at that memory address is what controls the border color. 53281 is what controls the background. So it's super cool to have that sort of low-level access directly from like the prompt that you get when you start it up. Something you just don't have with modern computers, and something I feel a lot of people miss, that sort of intimacy with the hardware. Probably sometime in the not too distant future, I'm probably gonna just do a video on programming in BASIC, and then gonna go a bit more in depth into how to actually program in BASIC. So let's get a floppy drive hooked up so we can load up some software. The one I have here is the Commodore 1541 Mark II. This is a later revision of the classic 1541. The main difference is it's white and it has an external power supply, and it has dip switches on the back for changing the device number. We can hook it up to the computer using this round serial cable. This is called Commodore's IEC interface, and it plugs in right next to the video port on the back of the computer like so. Then you can plug the other end into one of the two ports on the back of the drive. It doesn't really matter which one. There's two ports so that you can daisy chain them. IEC does support daisy chaining, so you can daisy chain multiple disk drives as well as printers and whatnot. Most programs can be loaded by loading the first file on the disk and running it. So to do that, we type load star, (8). Star basically means just to load the first file on the disk, and then (8) means the device number, and device 8 is usually always the disk drive, and it can take a while to load. Once it's loaded, we can type run. Commodore 64 was quite the capable gaming machine due to its SID chip and sound interface device, as well as a pretty capable graphics chip. So anyway, here are a few classics that'll give you an idea of what the Commodore 64 is capable of.
Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
One of the things that gave the Commodore 64 an edge in terms of games and just graphics in general were sprites. Basically what sprites are graphical objects that are independent of the rest of the screen, and they don't actually align with the pixels on the screen. You can move them by changing a single register, so they're really easy to move around and stuff, since you don't have to move all that pixel data around the screen in a screen buffer. You can just change a single value at a single memory location and move the sprite around the screen. You can also do things like change the colors by changing a single value in memory instead of having to update the values for each individual pixel. Sprites have both monochrome and multicolor variants. Sprites are also independent of the color cells of the 64. The screen is divided up into little cells, basically a foreground color and a background color for each cell, while the sprites are completely independent of that. Sprites also have a double width and double height option. The Commodore 64 supports up to 8 sprites on the screen at the same time. Sprites make it super easy to program moving objects and whatnot on the screen, and is really what gave the Commodore 64 an edge in terms of graphics over systems like the Apple II and TRS-80 color computer. Okay, so what are some other interesting programs you can run on your Commodore 64? Well, this first one's called S.A.M, and I'll let it speak for itself.
Hi, my name is Sam. I am one of the first text-to-speech programs for personal computers. You can make me say anything you want. You can even change the sound of my voice.
I did a whole video on S.A.M, which you can check out if you want. This next one here is called Geos, or Graphical Environment Operating System. It is basically a fully fledged GUI for the Commodore 64, and it's fairly impressive that they were able to fit this into 64K of RAM. That's running on a 1.2 MHz 8-bit CPU. It's got a fairly decent word processor built in, as well as this a paint program and stuff, and there were a few third-party applications that you could buy to use with Geos. You can control Geos with a number of different devices, including the Commodore 1351 mouse, which Commodore made for the 64, as well as a joystick, which is probably the most common and what I use, as well as a light pen. I already sort of did a video on Geos, but I do hope to do a more in-depth video on Geos at some point in the future. Eventually, Geos was actually bundled with the Commodore 64, more specifically when they brought out the 64C, the white model. A lot of those came with Geos bundled in with the computer. Another popular program, and one that I find quite fun to mess around with, is the Print Shop by Broderbund Software. It allows you to print out stuff like greeting cards, signs, letterheads, banners, and as well as make your own clip art graphics and stuff. Let's make a banner here and print it out. So we can pick a font. Let's go with tech. Let's just do an outline to save ink. Type our message, BTM 86. We can choose one of the preset graphics here. We can make our own graphics, we'll show you in a bit. Go down, let's pick floppy disk. We'll have a floppy disk on both ends. And now let's print it. Well, here it is, 4 pages long. The effect doesn't quite work with a modern printer. I don't actually have an old dot matrix printer. I had to print this out on a modern printer using Vice. But yeah, I see you have these little white areas where the pages overlap. I just taped it together on the back. Works a bit better with an old school tractor feed printer, where it'll all just be connected together. You have the little strips on the side. But anyway, it's still pretty cool. I'm gonna like put this in my room. There's also a built-in graphic editor where we can make our own little clip art graphics and include them in like our cards, signs, and banners and whatnot. This final program here is pretty interesting. It basically allows you to use your computer to generate certain tones that you can use to essentially hack the phone system and get like free long distance calls and whatnot. Fortunately, this doesn't really work anymore with the modern phone system. They've changed a bunch of things, but yeah, it's pretty cool. This was obviously not like sold in stores, just the sort of thing that would have got passed around like bulletin boards and stuff. Cool, we've now just made a long distance call that we aren't actually paying for. If this still worked. Obviously this probably hasn't worked since the early 90s. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about some modern day gadgets that I recommend getting for your 64 if you plan on using it in the modern age. These are two that I have, and what this is called a C64 saver. And this is pretty important that you invest in something like this. And the reason is, this is an original C64 power supply. This is the power brick that basically plugs into the outlet on one end, and this plugs into the power socket on your 64. And these power bricks inevitably fail over the years, and as they fail, they'll output more voltage than they should, and they'll fry your 64. So this one's still good. I've checked it several times, and it still outputs the right voltages. But for when it does fail, I have the C64 saver. This one's one of the ones by Ray Carlson. You can get it off his website. There are a few different ones you could find online, on like eBay and stuff, but it's the one that I have and the one that I like. So it goes in between your original power supply and your computer, and it protects it from any overvoltage. So if the voltage exceeds the rated voltage for the 64, it'll shut off the power and this light will turn red. It's sort of a peace of mind thing. These are a bit cheaper. If you're willing to spend the money, I definitely recommend just getting a modern day replacement power supply. These computers have enough of a following for that to exist. So yeah, I recommend at the very least using a C64 saver like this, or honestly just getting a modern power supply. This next device here is this thing. This is an SD to IEC. Camera to focus here. And what this does is it plugs into the cartridge port and the IEC port, and it allows you to use SD cards instead of a floppy drive. So it allows you to put a bunch of disk images on an SD card and then use that instead of a floppy drive, and it's just more convenient. It makes it easier to transfer disk images between your modern computer and your C64, and you mount disk images from the internet and share programs and stuff you created. It's got some buttons here for reset and whatnot, and there are a few different versions of this out there. The one I have also has an Epix fast loader cartridge built in, which gives you a few extra commands for working with disks and stuff, and speeds up the load times because they are kind of slow on these machines. You can get these on eBay, as well as this is a PCBWay shared project thing. I'll put a link in the description. I think you can still get these, but I don't know. So yeah, it's really cool that it has the Epix fast loader built in. So it goes into the cartridge port like that, and then this little cable runs over here and plugs into the serial port. Super cool device, worth every penny. So anyway, I'm afraid that's it for today's video. Thank you so much if you've made it this far, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you maybe learned something or just found it interesting. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.
I adore my 64. my Commodore 64. I cook with it, steam with it, educate the team with it, my Commodore 64. I pitch with it, catch with it, count my chicks before the hatch with it, my Commodore 64.
64K memory at a price that will put a computer in every home, business, and school years before anyone ever dreamed.
I adore my 64, my Commodore 64.